Hey, everybody, welcome to That Expert Show, where you help run the show. I'm Anna Canzano. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. Today we're talking about bullying, specifically the type of behavior that it leads to an imbalance between one person and another. It can be really tough to know how to deal with a bully. And we're not just talking about the type of bullies that you encounter, in childhood. Like, we'll certainly talk and give advice to parents about how to coach their kids through a situation where they feel like they're being bullied. But we'll also address in this episode how to deal with a bully in the workplace, how to deal with a bully in your family, because we all know these kind of situations don't just end the minute that you graduate from high school. You can deal with this kind of situation your whole life. We've got a great expert lined up today. She has 25 years of experience as a school counselor. She's the former director of K-12 counseling services out of New York, and she joins us live right now from New York. Dr. Deborah Hardy. Dr. Hardy, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Anna. What a pleasure to be able to share some ideas with you and your viewers.
Well, you run a fantastic Facebook group called School Counselor Central, where you provide advice and support to school counselors. But I really think, like I mentioned, some of this advice deals with, bullies of all ages. And I guess we should start by defining what is bullying necessarily. I think we all kind of inherently know what bullying is, but it's a term that's thrown around quite a bit.
It is, and I'm glad you're starting with a definition, because I think it's always important to understand what bullying really is. And it is, as you mentioned earlier, the imbalance of power, where one individual makes it difficult for another to feel safe in their environment and feels that they're taking their power away. And when I say power, it could be power of decision, power of being able to contribute, just not being comfortable in that environment, be it at home, be it at school, or be it in the workplace, or even the family, as you mentioned.
So let's say that you have a kid, and I understand that conversation is different for kids of different ages. Like, if my kindergartner comes home and says, maybe she doesn't really know that term, somebody's bullying me, but somebody is saying mean things to me on the playground, and it's happening pretty consistently, or, if that interaction is even physical, she's getting pushed down, what's the best way to handle that as a parent?
Well, as a parent, no matter what level, but especially with elementary, I think it's important to always first acknowledge the emotions. Let students and children talk about what happened. Acknowledge what they're feeling, that they're not feeling happy, or they were feeling that they got pushed over, or they're feeling sad, or maybe they're using the term bullied in it. So acknowledge that. And then second, clarify what really happened. Ask them to tell the story. Tell me a little bit more about what happened. When did this happen? And I tend to ask also, what about a team of people that were around you? And I use that term team because it's important for students and everybody else in general, adults or anybody who's feeling bullied, to know that there's a team of people that they can go to. So those would be the first things that I would suggest. Acknowledge the emotions, clarify what really happened, and identify who your team is that is around you at the moment, or a team of people you can go to at any time.
It's interesting because I think there are all different ways that people think that they can deal with bullies. There's like the old school way of dealing with it, and then there's the new school way of dealing with it. Chris, for example, on Facebook says, back in my day, if you got bullied, you punch that person in the mouth to show them they can't push you around. He wants to know, is it wrong to tell your kids to stand up for themselves physically if they feel intimidated?
Well, I'm not going to tell a parent if it's right or wrong to tell them something, but what I am going to say is that there are repercussions and consequences in school districts and around, right? And we live in an age in society now that, unfortunately, violence is becoming more predominant in different areas. So I would recommend, is there a different way to approach this before you go down the old school method? Yes, there is. When I mention know your team players, it's important in schools that you're able to, as a parent, contact the administration, contact the school counselor, contact a school psychologist or a social worker or the assistant principal, or even the teacher, depending on who you have on your team, and say, listen, this is what's been happening in the school bus, this is what's been happening in the lunchroom, in the classroom, and I really would like to come in personally and talk about this and see how we can handle it. A school will never put the other student who might be pushing the buttons, as I call it, in front of the one who's receiving the mean comments, because that's just going to make it a negative situation for both. You don't want to make it uncomfortable for both. While you're handling your child or yourself in a bullying situation, be also aware that the person who is being mean, who is bullying, has some emotional triggers going on that are causing him or her to do such an act. And so we have to be sensitive to that and not only help our own children, but help that child or children who are acting upon their emotions to bully.
So, I mean, what would you say would be some suggestions? Because I want to advise my kids with some, concrete ideas with things that they could say in response to someone who is being mean to them or bullying them. For kids that are between the ages of like kindergarten and high school, what are some examples of responses that they can offer to this obviously emotionally troubled kid that doesn't feel very good about themselves, so they're being mean to other kids?
Correct. It's very hard for any child at any age. We don't like confrontations to go up and say something right away. But the more we practice with our children about what to say, the better equipped they are going to be. So some of the suggestions might be just go up to the student and say, I really don't like what you're saying to me, or you are making me uncomfortable. Or in some situations, if students are not comfortable, especially younger ages, going up to someone and saying, you're making me unhappy, or you're treating me poorly, or you're being mean to me, then that's when they can go to the teacher in the location and say, I'm not comfortable sitting next to, and name that in the student that's bothering them. The teacher then will pull the students aside and be able to speak to them. If there's a counselor, and in many elementary schools now, there are school counselors present who are doing a lot of this emotional training and tips to give to kids on how to deal with situations of this nature, they should go speak to them because maybe they tried saying, your comment to me was negative. I didn't like what you said to me, and it didn't work out. So now go find part of your team that you have, and it might be a school counselor or a psychologist, and say, what else can I do? As parents, I always suggest an activity that's wonderful that's called chart the size of the problem. So sit down with your child after the situation has happened, if they haven't been able to speak back to someone or are uncomfortable in speaking to that mean person, and just talk to them. How big was this problem? Is this happening to everybody? Is this just happening to you? Does it happen 2 or 3 or 4 times a day? And chart it out. If it's, and I'm not dismissing any size of the problem, I want to make that clear. There are different responses at different sizes of the problem. So if it's just happening, then equip that student, that child, to say, I'm not happy, you're being mean to me, I don't like what you're saying. If it keeps occurring more and more, they might need to address it a different way.
You know, it's interesting though, because I was just talking about this with my producer, Bella. Sometimes the lines aren't well defined. It's not always black and white. There's a lot of gray there. Sometimes your worst bully-ish type person that you're dealing with may be your friend, like your frenemy. Girls are known especially for this, because we can be mean. Girls can be very mean, even though somebody's supposedly your friend.
Absolutely. I mean, you're right on target. So part of another tactic or strategy I suggest is having parents be able to do some role plays. Role plays are very good for all levels, and just sit down at a table, no technology around, and say, if I came up to you as your friend and said this, what would you do? And parents are always observing things, especially with frenemies, and or friends around the house, and they say, "Oh yeah, so and so made this comment, and it wasn't a very pleasant comment." And sit down and talk to your child about that role-playing situation. I heard your friend say this, or I heard someone say this to you. And role play. Why weren't you able to say this is not making me comfortable, or I didn't like the way you said something? I think that's very, very an important process in this.
Part of the feedback that we got as we posted the topic for this show, as we always do, is like a lot of parents say, "Oh, just tell your kids to walk away, stay away from them, don't engage with them. That's what a bully wants, is for you to interact with them." Technology makes it a little hard to just walk away now sometimes, because if the bullying, the mean behavior is occurring via social media for the world to see, or it's via a text message, I really kind of feel bad for kids, who are in their teenage years nowadays, who, at least when we were little and you dealt with somebody at school that was unpleasant, you could go home at the end of the day, you were done dealing with them. And now it's like 24 hours a day, you could be subject to someone else's mean behavior.
Right, and I think a piece of that goes back to the root cause of why bullying is happening. And especially with social media, there's this sense of belonging that our society engages in, K-adulthood. So it's not just kindergarten, elementary, middle school, or high school. You have it also as adults. We all want to belong to some kind of community. And when we don't fit into that community is when things get shared right away and information gets spread right away. So my tips are always be careful what you post. Think about this being someone you know, or your sister, your brother, your cousin, whoever it might be, posts this and then gets bullied. How would you feel? So don't do it, right? Take it personal, think, reflect. I think we need to disengage in order to disengage. I always tell my students, sometimes you need to just disconnect in order to have some peace in your life. Who cares what's going on in social media right now? If they need to get you, they will call you on the phone, and disconnect in order to reconnect. And that gives you a little bit of a breather to tone down your emotions so that you can think accordingly. Because what often happens with social media is the minute we see something pop up, we react, and then someone else reacts, and then someone else reacts. And so sometimes you have to say, slow down. Let me just turn my phone off for a bit, my computer. I actually had a young man who wrote his college application, give him a little shout out here on what he learned about going to a summer camp where they had no access to technology. And it's interesting because at summer camp, the students and youngsters are able to work problems out, as opposed to when they have the social media turned on, they're just going at it without having the face-to-face conversations.
Right. Yeah, that's a hard argument to make, because I think when you're dealing with a teenager, they're terrified at the idea of walking away from social media because of what could happen in their absence if they're not present, to either vouch for themselves or maybe somebody else that's in a situation like that. But that is good advice. Might just be a hard sell for some teenagers.
It is.
Heather had a question. She says, the stats on bullying are interesting. She's always encouraging her kids to be upstanders because, in many cases, bullying activity ends if just one person steps up on behalf of the victim. However, she says in this day and age, getting involved can be dangerous. How do you help your kids understand when it's best to speak up and when it's safer to seek help elsewhere?
Boy, that's a loaded question, but she's absolutely right. So let me start with my first advice is to connect with the school district that the child's in. And I urge all parents to do so and find out what programs are being utilized in the school to teach students to be mindful and to, and to be able to stand up and be an upstander in these situations and feel confident. So it's not just, I want to tell you that I don't like what you're doing. I have to have the confidence to engage in that moment and be able to say, I don't like what you're doing, so that I'm okay with whatever repercussions come back. So schools are teaching kids how to do this, be it through school counseling or teachers. So there's a couple of programs. Mindfulness program is coming in strong into districts and teaching students to take a breath before they act. So I always suggest to parents, please find out what are some of the topics that your counselors or psychologists or social workers or teachers are teaching on this that you can practice at home with your child. There's something called, especially for elementary, something called the buddy breathing, where they put their hands on their stomach or they have a little stuffed animal and they watch it go up and down, which relaxes them before they attack someone or say something they're going to regret. So that's one piece. Another one is Responsive Classroom, and that's a curriculum-based program that allows for students and teachers to have morning meetings, and student support staff, your psychologists, social workers, and school counselors will attend those too for the most part, and they can listen to what is the issue of the day. So if a student mistreated another, and I remember seeing this in the elementary school I was overseeing, as a director of school counseling, where kids would come in and say, this happened on the school bus today. My friend was bullied on the school bus. And between the teacher and the other kids, they engaged in solutions. And then another program that's very popular is something called bucket filling, where students get these concepts of giving compliments means you're filling someone's bucket. And when they see someone give them a negative comment or give someone a negative comment, it's bucket dipping. And often you will hear the kids walking around the school saying, hey, you're dipping into my bucket, or you're dipping into someone else's bucket. And those are great programs that they're learning throughout the school day and utilizing that can then be brought into home for parents to continue utilizing the same terminology. It just builds upon what they're learning.
So that would be question, something. Though, when is it safer? How do you know how to coach your kids on when it is time to speak up versus seek help from someone else?
Absolutely. So if a young child or a young adult sees someone saying something negatively to someone else, they can go up to them, and it's the first time they see that there's no threat involved. It's just what you and I may call teasing, but nowadays it's called bullying, to go up and say, hey, stop it, no need for that. I had a situation recently where one of the students was a freshman in high school sitting by himself in a cafeteria, and a couple of upperclassmen said, hey, that's our table, typical high school lunchroom if you want to say that. And another high school student turned around and said to the boy, hey, why don't you get to know him? He's brand new here in the high school. And that stopped everything. So that's a safe zone to go up and talk to someone. If you see that this is really getting into more of a physical setting, or the tone of voice is becoming higher and the argument is escalating, then that's when you get someone involved.
Yeah, that's good advice. We did get some feedback via Facebook, private message, because I think sometimes people want a little confidentiality when they're asking these questions. A lady wrote in asking for suggestions in dealing with bullies within her own family. If friends were treating her as some in her family have, she would have stopped interacting a long time ago.
It's interesting. Love family, but sometimes family has its own dynamics, and it's very difficult, right? Because it can set a situation of half of the family then liking you and half of the family not liking you. It can create more problems than a business environment or a school environment, not to say that one's worse than the other. So how do you deal with the family? My first suggestion would be bring that adult over, and sometimes that family member or adult may not know that how they're acting towards you is making you uncomfortable. And I think having a one-to-one conversation with that person might be your first way to start. And just say, I've noticed that on certain occasions, on Thanksgiving, on birthday parties, you tend to constantly pick on me. Why is that happening? What have I done to cause this? And you're probably going to get a reaction of surprise, something like, I didn't know I was doing that. Because some people see humor in teasing others as a way of feeling like they belong in a family or they belong in that environment. And that could easily be eliminated. If it doesn't happen, if it becomes more of an altercation, then at that point, find your team in the family, right? I hate saying this, but go to mom or dad and say, look, I'm having a really hard time. Can you help me here? Or maybe there might be another sibling that has a better relationship or a tighter relationship in communication with the one that's bothering you. That would be my advice. Family is tough.
Yeah, because you're related by blood. And sometimes you don't get to choose your family, right? You don't necessarily also get to choose who shows up at the holiday gathering. We also got some comments and questions for people who wanted to know how to deal with the workplace. One person, for example, Sunset Guru, says it would be nice to help kids and adults learn how to deal with bullying in the workplace. Everybody thinks it'll be over past high school. It's not. This person says, in their experience in the workplace, you're better off finding a better job, get out before all the fighting, as opposed to fruitless negotiation attempts with bullies and apathetic deadwood management that provides safe harbor to abusers. What's your take on that?
I think the word confrontation comes up immediately. Nobody likes confrontations, and leadership styles also comes up when it comes to the workplace. So you have leadership that may not like to deal with confrontation. You have leadership that's too busy doing something else and doesn't want to address it right now, or may not even know about it. In fairness, nobody has sat down and said, hey, this is what's really happening. My first suggestion is always follow the chain of command in business, and you know your environment better than I do, so I'm going to just give a broad idea of strategy. Follow the chain of command. Go to the person who is bullying you and say to them very clearly, you're making me uncomfortable. Have the conversation. Find out why they're doing this. Has something happened in an interaction that made them obtain that power? Remember, it's about power for one and eliminating the power of the other towards you. And if it's not getting any better, and by the way, when you have the conversation, have also a plan of action. Say, can we call it a truce now? Can we move forward? Can we agree that if you have an issue with me, you're going to come and find me and we're going to have a good conversation about what's happening? Because sometimes I'm human. I don't know that what I said may have caused something for someone, right? So clearing the air first. If that continues, if the behavior continues, then I think the next step is going to the supervisor and talking about it, sitting down, having a mediator in front of you. But again, only if the other party who might be bullying you or making you uncomfortable is amicable to that. In the workplace, it can get very dicey and horrible because you've got unions, you've got contracts, you've got employee negotiations going on and things of that nature. So the human resource may come into play also. Just be aware of that. If you've put everything in play and you've done everything correctly in terms of following the chain of command, and then it's really uncomfortable, I hate saying this, but you may have to get some legal suggestion.
Yeah, I've definitely seen people take that route, and it has been effective in the past in situations that I've seen. Circling back to kids and their interactions with adults. This is interesting. Somebody posted on the Oregonian's website. I have a partnership now with the newspaper here in Oregon, and we talked about this topic that we would be presenting. They're saying that parents and teachers bully children as well. It goes on in everyday life, not easy to deal with. Grades in school are a form of bullying often, and people, it's hard for people to realize that it's even happening. So I think this person's talking about, parents bullying kids, teachers who are favoring some kids over others, and it even affecting, the grade that they issue to a child.
It's really interesting to hear that and sad to hear it. I think what's happened is we've lost, and I'm speaking as Dr. Hardy, my assumption, sometimes we've lost the sense of what the whole child is, right? And the whole child is about the social, emotional, the academic, the college career pathways. And we're stuck in a situation where many kids, and I've experienced this, feel that they are defined by the grade. And that's where, remember the idea of the sense of belonging that I was mentioning, that they're going to get validation and a sense of belonging from parents if they're getting hundreds on everything, that they're going to get into a great college because they've had this and the parent approval is going to come in. And the same with the teacher in terms of my teacher likes me or doesn't like me, therefore I got this grade or that grade. I think when you're faced with, let me start with the teacher, and there's a question on discrepancy and what's really going on and building relationships in classroom, there's nothing wrong in a parent requesting a parent-teacher meeting, even at the high school level and middle school, to say, how's my child doing? I've sat in plenty of parent-teacher meetings where out of the blue, the parent says, oh yes, my child says you don't like them. And of course, as a counselor, I'm like mortified at the time, right, when that happens. But it opens a door to have a good discussion. And, often teachers, again, might feel a little bit put on the spot, but it's a great discussion to say, how is this child getting this perception? Because it's all about perception, right? Right or wrong, and I'm not saying it's not happening, it's about perception. And so talking about how the child got that perception, let's go back to the root cause. What was it that caused this child to think that the grading system is a way to bully a child, him or her? The same with the parent issue in terms of that. I'm assuming that your reader probably was thinking about parents bullying teachers or parents bullying kids.
It sounds like kids.
What's your sense?
Those situations that you hear about where parents, have identified a kid that they don't like for some reason and will make, under their breath comments to that kid or whatnot.
Yeah, and it's all about the sense of, again, competition, perception. We need to step back. We need to not listen to, as I call my coffee clutch in the community, and who's saying what, that this is a good kid, bad kid. I have to tell you, I see so many students coming through my office, and they are wonderful. And their self-esteem sometimes can be low, sometimes can be high. Those who are low have probably experienced some kind of circumstance of bullying or being spoken about or being labeled bad kid. But we don't know them, and they're wonderful students searching for their purpose in life. And I think some of them find their purpose through high grades and academic achievement, while other ones are more hands-on. So I think we need to step back and remind parents they're all part of our community. They're all children, and they're going to succeed. Let's help them.
So my last question to you, and it's kind of my devil's advocate question. A lot of what you've preached here is, go seek help from the team, go find the resources, tell someone what is happening. How do you do all that? Because, nobody likes a tattle, right? You want to feel like you can deal with it on your own, and you don't want to be labeled a tattle to, the other people in your social group.
Well, thank you for that, because you're not a tattle. You want to go to an expert in the building, be it a school counselor, social worker, or psychologist, or a teacher or administrator, and say, I'm dealing with this situation. That's one way. If a student's uncomfortable doing that, many schools have what's called anonymous alert. Anonymous alert is where a parent or a student can send in an anonymous email to the school and say, I'm feeling uncomfortable. Of course, the school's not going to know who this person is, but there was a situation I dealt with at one point where a student sent an anonymous alert saying, this person is making me uncomfortable. This person is bullying many of my friends. So the person receiving that message is going to then act upon meeting with the bully. not necessarily know who the others are. And then there's something in some states called the Dignity for All Students Act, where parents can put in a notification to the district that there is an uncomfortable situation happening towards their child by another child. But this is where you're going to cite names, and that might make it more uncomfortable. I always recommend find someone that you as a student feel comfortable talking to and trust, and let them be your anchor, your support.
Great advice. We'll have to check into those, and we'll include that information in the tip sheet that we provide along with this episode, as we always do. Dr. Hardy, thanks so much for your insight.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of That Expert Show. You can always check out the previous episodes at thatexpertshow.com. Connect with me on social media. I am on Facebook at Anna Canzano, on Twitter and Instagram at That Expert Show. You can also watch previous episodes on our YouTube channel, That Expert Show, and you can listen to our show as a podcast. So whether it's Apple iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, whatever platform that you're using to listen to podcasts, we are there. Thanks so much for being part of the show. You really do help with the content of the show. You direct where the interview goes based on the information that you provide to me and your questions and comments. So I really appreciate that. And give us a like or a subscribe, and tell a friend about the show. We always try to do topics that help people in their everyday lives. That's kind of the whole genesis of this show. So appreciate you being along for the journey, and we'll see you on the next episode of That Expert Show, where you help run the show.